So I want to walk through human evolution just because it is so absolutely fascinating, and people are usually very interested in this. From the Explore video, you should have learned some of the features that we take a look at to decide if something is on the human lineage or if it's on the ape lineage or if it's getting closer to human versus the other great apes. And so things like the brow ridge and how pronounced it is, and whether or not we have a nose bone, and the shape of the palate, and the things that you went through in the Explore. Then you had a chance to look at several skulls and try to decide if they were older or newer, more ape-like or more human-like. And so I actually want to go through our family tree, if you will, just to give you a little more information about what we know. Because a lot of times there is this impression that we don't know very much about human evolution, that we don't have very many fossils. We have one or two of each of these, and that's simply untrue. We actually know more about the evolution of our species than any other species on Earth. We have found hundreds of individuals, and we have lots and lots of evidence of these creatures that they did exist here on Earth. So let's go back to the very beginning of our lineage. This Sahelanthropus cadensis is, or Chad, it's from Chad is where they discovered it, Chadensis. This is one of those, the earliest species we think belongs on the Homo, kind of on our ancestral family tree. It's not a Homo, it's a Sahelanthropus, but it's very close. And so it's kind of the root of our tree. It lived 6 million years ago in Africa. We see evidence that it walked upright, and we can tell this by looking at the pelvis and how it's built. But it seems like it spent a lot of time in the trees, and we can see this too by the look of its hands. If you look at a gorilla's hand or a chimpanzee's hand, their fingers are very curved, suggesting that they were grabbing onto tree branches, whereas ours are very straight. So anyway, there's a lot of features of the skeleton that we can tell where they spent most of their time, whether they were walking upright. It has somewhat of a human-like face, but very much chimp-looking in the rest of it. Very pronounced brow ridges, a bit of a muzzle protruding out. All right, so if we go from there, we get to Ardipithecus. So Ardipithecus, or Ardi, this is sort of a side group, another species that didn't survive. So we have the Homo lineage, then we have this Ardipithecus, and we have an Australopithecus I'll show you in a minute. But this was him. He's fairly small. He's got very long arms. You can see those in the picture. Very ape-like. You can see this particular skeleton is in pieces, but protruding brow ridges, protruding muzzle, looking much more ape-like than human-like, but did walk upright, looking at its pelvis. Okay, discovered in October of 2009, took 15 years to put this together. It's one of the oldest and most complete skeletons of one of our human ancestors, 4.4 million years ago. Oops, okay, cranial capacity is very small. Looking at Australopithecus, this is another side shoot, Australopithecus afarensis, and this is who we call Lucy. You probably are familiar with this particular skeleton. We have a replica of it down here in the Life Science building on the second floor. This particular skeleton, it was only about 3 feet 8 inches tall, found in Ethiopia, fairly small cranial capacity. It's rather tiny, but the joints around the knee indicate that it walked upright. And this is really a cool story. If you look at that picture in the upper right, I want to look at it a little more. In 1997, scientists found the footprints of 2 Australopithecus species, or 2 individuals, that must have walked through some volcanic ash before it had hardened. And what we see is, first, we see that the heel hits first and pushes off the toe, just like our foot. That they have an arch, just like our foot. These 2 individuals were walking close together, and one is rather large and one is much smaller, suggesting maybe it was a man and a woman, or a mother and a child. And very cool, right next to it, you can see off on the side of that picture, we see a 3-toed horse that was walking alongside, almost as if it was their pet. So pretty cool little species that we have found. All right, so here's another Australopithecus. This is Australopithecus africanus. We have what we call the twang child. It was a very small individual, and you can actually see sort of some of the ridges right here where sand crept into the brain case and actually solidified around the brain, and so you can see the indentations of the sulci and gyri of the brain, which is kind of cool. It has a very human-like pelvis, but was just a child when he died. It looks like some blunt force trauma to his head. Paranthropus is another side group. Paranthropus didn't survive beyond to where we see Homo species coming about. But this is an interesting species. It has sexual dimorphism, so very much like a gorilla, where the males are really, really large and the females are much smaller. But one of the things you should notice about these species is that sagittal crest on the top of their head. This is an attachment point for your jaw muscles. So the larger the sagittal crest, the stronger your jaw. So really the take-home message about these guys is that they were mean, that they could chomp through you or anything else, just similar to a gorilla today. This is where Homo, the actual genus Homo, emerged, and the first one is Homo habilis. So this is 1.9 to 1.6 million years ago. They still have a fairly small cranium, but this man, Homo habilis, means handy man. You can see that the face is flattening out. We don't have that protruding muzzle anymore. We're starting to get a tiny little bit of a nose bone. Our jaw still goes fairly straight back, suggesting that maybe we don't have a lot of articulation in the mouth. It was discovered in 1961 by Lewis and Mary Leakey, which are very famous people in hominid discoveries in Kenya, South Africa, and Ethiopia. But we see evidence that they were using tools, and in fact, a lot of the tools that we see of them, we think that the paranthropus that were living at the same time likely used those too. So it's hard to know who was using them, but we do know that they had the hand anatomy to be using tools. Next, we have Homo ergaster. This is about 2 million years ago. One of the main, most complete skeletons we have is an 8-year-old boy called the Turkana boy. Physically, they were more advanced than modern 8-year-olds, so that's one of the features of Homo sapiens, of our species, that's rather unique, and that's a really long childhood. We stay little and disproportionate from a morphological standpoint for a very long time. And I mean, you've seen babies, right? Their head is gigantic and the rest of their body is small. And you don't see that so much in the great apes. And so this particular species, Homo ergaster, you see that this 8-year-old was pretty advanced for an 8-year-old, didn't look like an 8-year-old today, which suggests that their childhood was a lot shorter. They matured a lot more quickly. But based on the skeleton, they estimate that he would have reached 6 feet tall. And this is also where you start to see the shortened arms and long legs, suggesting, less of a tree lifestyle and more of an on-the-ground, walking upright lifestyle. All right, so now we have Homo erectus. A lot of times Homo ergaster and Homo erectus are equated as the same species. The difference is that Homo erectus left Africa. They were the first to leave Africa. We find them mostly in Asia, but it could be that it was a branch of ergaster that left. You can see from the palate it's beginning to flare out, and we're starting to get a bit of a dome there. We still have quite pronounced brow ridges, but less so than before. We also have a bit of a nose bone, and the muzzle is distinctively pulled back in towards the face, so a lot flatter of a face, but no chin yet. Interesting thing about this guy, we find him a lot in Asia, the Peking man. They lived for a very long time. This particular species, or this particular specimen, we think was 400,000 years ago, and it was found in a hyena den. In fact, we find a lot of them in hyena dens, suggesting that they were a popular snack. So they were more of a prey item than a predator as we are today. So here is a really cool species. This is Homo floresiensis. It was found on the island of Flores, right off the coast of Indonesia. There's actually more than 6 individuals. They're really short. They're only 3.5 feet tall, but they look very, very human. Look at that face, right? It looks, compared to a Homo sapiens, it looks very, very human. They have a nose bone, they have a flat face, they have very little brow ridges, they walked upright, their jaws look very human. They had very sophisticated technology, weaponry, that kind of thing, and they lived up to 13,000 years ago, which means Homo sapiens were around at that time. They overlapped us. They were still there, but they were on this secluded island, and it's interesting. Also on that island, we find dwarf elephants and other dwarf species, suggesting that maybe nutrition was pretty poor on the island. And we get this a lot. You actually get island dwarfism. So the really cool species was likely highly intelligent, but very, very tiny. We call them the hobbits. All right, so Neanderthal is probably one of the species you've definitely heard of. They first appeared around 200,000 years ago in Europe and Western Asia. They definitely overlapped our existence, and there is solid evidence that we interbred with them. So we weren't exactly totally speciated, I suppose. They died out around 30,000 years ago, so Homo sapiens were around. Their brain case is really large, if larger than ours in some cases of the specimens we've found. We have lots and lots of specimens of them. They made very sophisticated tools. They had the capability of language, which means that if we look at the anatomy of their mouth, they had a domed palate and flaring teeth, suggesting that they have great tongue manipulation. It looks like they had a voice box that had dropped similar to ours, but we don't exactly know how much language they use. That kind of stuff doesn't really fossilize, so it's hard to know. Their front teeth were very worn in most of the specimens we found, suggesting they probably still use them as tools. They were very robust, large bodies, thick bones. They lived in very harsh circumstances, and they were pretty tough. We have evidence that they had a controlled use of fire. Some really cool things about them is that they actually bury their dead. It's the first species we see that are doing this, and in fact they bury the dead with like afterlife, with like goods, jewelry and tools, suggesting they believed in an afterlife. It's definitely not as sophisticated and ceremonial as we do today, but they did do that. We also see, which is so cool, is we found some older individuals that have very life-threatening injuries, like a broken femur that has healed. So we see evidence, the bone is fused back together and they've healed. Now, given the drasticness of the injury, they most definitely would have died had they not taken care of this individual, and this individual lived a long life. So that suggests that this particular species had compassion and altruism and actually cared for one another, which is really neat, and they overlapped us in existence time. And then we have Homo sapiens. From the latest evidence, we actually think that the earliest Homo sapiens were somewhere between 250 and 300,000 years ago, so a little older than we originally thought. But there are kind of more primitive ones like Cro-Magnon man that look a little more caveman-ish, for lack of a better term, and then more modern ones. In 2003, scientists found Homo sapien remains in Ethiopia that they've dated to 160,000 years ago. In Israel, we found some up to 93,000 years ago, and then, like I said, the latest finds have found them up to 250,000 years ago. So we've been around a very long time. Now, where Adam and Eve fit into that, we really have no idea, and I guess it's okay to not know. But we do know that Homo sapiens, the species that is us, has been around for at least 200,000 years. Now I want to talk about my favorite species. This is a brand new one that was discovered just recently, like just a couple years ago, in the Naledi cave system in South Africa. Naledi means star, and if you look at this cave, so there's one entrance from the top here, and you have to crawl deep down into this cave, and then you have to slide through this little tunnel called the Superman crawl that's only 8 inches tall. It opens into this really wide chamber, and you have to climb up this mountain, slide through another very small chamber, and then go head first down this incredibly long chute into the Dinaledi chamber. This is where we find these specimens, and there are 30 plus individuals down there. They found some other, this is where the Naledi system comes out, but they've actually found some other chambers branching off of this where we also find this species. If you look at her, she's kind of an in-between. So her brain case is fairly small, suggesting that she may not have been incredibly intelligent, but her face is rather human. She has a bit of a nose bone. Her body is very human-like. She walked upright. She has shorter arms, but longer fingers. So kind of an ape-like fingers, but human-like hand, human-like pelvis, ape-like feet. So she's this really interesting mix. But what's even cooler about it is that they're found deep in this cave system, in this deep, dark shaft. In fact, the way that they were found was by some adventurous spelunkers that were down there, and they thought they had come across human remains. And so they notified the authorities, who notified the scientists. Now, most scientists can't actually get down there because of the size of the Superman crawl. So the 2 scientists that discovered this species, this is Lee Berger and John Hawks, they actually put out a call on Facebook to recruit really small, adventurous female scientists who were willing to spelunk down into this cave and gather these specimens. And so they did that, and they brought them all up, and everything they've brought up they've immediately put online for everybody to see, which is also rather unusual in the hominid crowd. to be very open about it. So we've seen everything that's been coming up out of this cave. And what's very interesting is it's very, very dark and very deep in this cave. And they've explored several hypotheses trying to figure out how they got there and why. There's no evidence that they had controlled fire. One of the hypotheses was that perhaps they were dragged in there by predatory animals, but there's no evidence of predatory animals or other prey down there. Potentially they were living down there, but there's no evidence of food items or any kind of living tools that might have been down there. It's also hypothesized that there may have been a flood that washed them in there, but there's no evidence of sediment that would necessarily be there if it was floodwaters. Some have suggested there used to be an alternative opening, maybe up here to the Dinaledi chamber, but they've looked at the sediments on the roof and they've looked at the age of the rock, and there does not appear to be any disturbance at the top of the cavern. And so the only hypothesis they haven't been able to rule out is that they were taken there by someone else. And who would that be? Well, they overlapped Homo sapiens in their existence. So it's hypothesized that they were dumped there by our species, which is kind of creepy and cool at the same time. We've done it before in the past. So kind of cool. This is still coming about. They're still gathering these specimens. They're still discovering more. So stay tuned for more on Homo naledi. So if you look at this, you can see about where all of these species evolved or where they existed. And you can see that most of them, their existence times overlap. And so you're often tempted to draw this particular progression that one turned into another, that turned into another, that turned into another. But it's much more accurate to draw it as a branching tree, where these are all sort of cousins of each other when two populations separate and then one becomes one and one becomes another. So as you draw your tree, be thinking about that.